This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, we got a special return guest on the podcast today, and it is the one and only Voddie Baucham. So if you're not familiar with Voddie, he is a Reformed pastor, author, church planter, and sought-after speaker. He is the Dean of Theology at African Christian University in Lusaka, Zambia. He received his MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and his DMin from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and did his postgraduate study at Oxford. And he has written a myriad of amazing books. So Fault Lines is one of them. A lot of you guys are familiar with that. It is on our book list of the 100 books every modern Christian man should read list, in addition to Family Shepherds, which is a tremendous book. Every dad has to read that book. But he's got a new book out now. It's called It's Not Like Being Black: How Sexual Activists Hijacked the Civil Rights Movement. And I got to tell you, I've read a good amount of books for 2024 so far. This is my favorite book that I've read so far in 2024. I said that during the interview. I said that to him before the interview. And what's interesting about this is, if you guys listened to episode 505 of this podcast, I told you Voddie Baucham was on like my Mount Rushmore of guests that I had tried to get on the show and just wasn't able to get him on the show. It took us maybe 3 or 4 years to solidify the last interview. And now it just seems like, well, every time he writes a book, I guess we'll just have him on the show. So I feel very thankful for that. But I was very thankful to do this interview because this book is going to get panned and crushed and shadow banned way more than Fault Lines. Because in Fault Lines, he went after kind of the racial narrative happening inside the United States, and now he's taking on the actual sacred cow of the LGBTQ plus lobby, and that's going to be a tremendous thing. They're going to absolutely come after him. This book is out now, and once you read it, you'll get exactly, why I'm saying that. But we do talk a little bit about, the continued success and relevance of Fault Lines, but then we dig into the book. We talk about this idea of how sexual minorities has become this thing that people really are focused in on. And it's all because we've bought into this idea as a culture that sexual orientation is no different than race. And so we talk about the non-evidentiary basis of that. We talk about the process that was put into place to normalize these things. We talk about some of the very important people that are part of that. So we talk about Alfred Kinsey and John Money and Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen. We also talk about the fact that we live in kind of this post-Obergefell world where we just think, oh, well, I guess marriage has been redefined. No biggie. Let's all move on. And we talk about how if you seed that ground, you're seeding ground in a bunch of other areas. And part of our problem is because we do have a lot of weak-kneed pastors that just are go along to get along. They just want to be known for what they're for, not what they're against. And they've kind of allowed for some of these things to come in. And we talked about all kinds of other stuff in this interview. We really weaved in and out of a lot of different areas. And we talked about Martin Luther King Jr. a little bit as well, because everyone just thinks he's completely off limits and can't be critiqued. So we do talk about that a little bit. But guys, I was very happy to have him back on. I'm very happy to share it with you. So without further ado, let's get into it. Voddie Baucham, welcome back to Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. And I just got to tell you right from the beginning, I've never been so self-conscious of what I'm wearing, because typically I just go with the regular old black t-shirt so as to not offend. But look at you. You look fantastic.
Yeah, man. Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Well, I'm excited to dig into all this today, but before we dig into the new book, so the new book is absolutely fantastic. I'm very excited to dig into that. I want to talk just a little bit about Fault Lines, because I'm curious, as you were writing Fault Lines, because I had a similar conversation about something similar with Carl Trueman when he wrote one of his latest books. He had no idea it was going to have the impact that it had. When you were writing Fault Lines, did you think that still in 2024, that it would be selling, that it would be relevant, that people would be referring back to it, that people would be asking you to do interviews just to talk about that book? Did you think that was happening when you were writing it?
I hoped it would. I really believed that it was an important moment. And I really believed that, I had something that I needed to say, in that moment. And I did. I really did hope that it would help people. I felt like people were searching and wanting to understand what was going on. And, I had been talking about these things for a while and seeing people helped by that, so I really hoped that it would have that kind of impact. And I also expected that it would elicit the kind of negative response, that it did as well. So not too surprised.
Well, it certainly had that, and we added it to our book list on our website. We have a book list called the 100 Books Every Modern Christian Man Should Read list, and Fault Lines is certainly on there. And anytime you write something that's even vaguely controversial in this space, people are going to blow it up. And so that's certainly going to happen with your newest book, which, guys, if you're listening to this on time, it is out now. It is called It's Not Like Being Black: How Sexual Activists Hijacked the Civil Rights Movement. And so I told you this off air, but so far in 2024, I have not read a better book. It was just an absolutely fantastic book. I mostly read it on a plane, which is not really my favorite place to read. It's kind of hard for me to concentrate. And I felt like I was just zoned in from the very beginning. But I feel like, Voddie, the best way for me to introduce this book to the audience is to actually read a quote from your conclusion. And so I'm going to be reading a lot of quotes from the book today. And so, guys, if you hate hearing me read out loud, you're going to absolutely hate this. But let me read this quote from the conclusion. Writing this book has been one of the most challenging and emotionally draining undertakings of my life. I have grown weary of being accused of catastrophism, homophobia, fascism, and plain old hatred in the course of the 20 years that have passed since I first began speaking about it. I have faced protests at live events, threats of violence, and censure of various types. I also have grown weary of reading, hearing, and seeing things that grieve my soul as I research this topic. So I guess first question of the day, Voddie, is why in the world did you write this book? If it was going to be this horrible, big task, like why did you write it? And then I guess go ahead and give us the thesis of the book, and then we'll dig in.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. This is kind of a second version of the book. Back 2010 to 2012, I wrote a proposal for It's Not Like Being Black. We were coming off the Prop 8 decision in California, which was in 2008. The Advocate, leading gay newspaper, responded to that with a cover page, or as a magazine rather, cover page article, Gay is the New Black. And I had become aware of the book after the ball. The subtitle of that book is How America Will Overcome Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the Decade of the 90s. It was written in 1989, and it blew my mind.
Yeah.
It read like history. Now, it was the strategy written in 1989, but reading it, 2010 or so, it read like history. Like somebody went back and said, this is what they did. But what it was a strategy. So I was trying to write warning and mobilizing people against the march toward same-sex marriage. Christian publishers didn't want to publish the book. Like nobody wants to publish the book. One very large Christian publisher, my literary agent, sent the proposal. I mean, the whole big proposal for the book. Like it's a big drawn out process. They sent the proposal, and he got a rejection email. But he contacted me and he sent me the email. He said, pay attention to the time I sent the email with the proposal and the time he sent the rejection.
Right.
It was like 15 minutes, man.
Boom.
I mean, it was like 15. So, I've been writing and teaching about this. There's, messages of mine, sermons, lectures, Gay is Not the New Black, for over a decade, that have been circulating. And so Obergefell happens, and then the bottom fell out. I mean, the bottom fell out. Things started moving so rapidly after Obergefell, and Christians started talking about, we stopped talking about the issue of same-sex marriage. It was like, okay, it's the law now. Let's move on, right? And so as these things began to proliferate, and as I saw the costs starting to mount, and what I mean by that is, people being told, bake the cake, or have your business shut down. People losing their coaching jobs, people losing their teaching, positions, people losing their, jobs and families and all these sort of things. That, sort of aroused me again. But then when people went from attacking God's plan for marriage, family, and human sexuality to attacking the very fabric of creation itself, right? There is no male, there is no female. If I declare that I'm this, then it was like our Caesar is Lord moment. It's like the culture is saying to us, I know you see a man in front of you, but you will declare that this is a woman, or you will pay the price. Bend the knee to Caesar right now, or you will pay the price. I mean, it was just a bridge too far. And then finally, I'll say this. In Fault Lines, I use the illustration, or in talking about the critical social justice movement, I use the illustration of a train. And there's many boxcars on this train. And I was saying back then, the so-called racial justice boxcar is a boxcar that a lot of people felt comfortable, jumping onto. But behind that boxcar was the sexual identity boxcar, and the immigration boxcar, and the climate change boxcar, and and so on and so on and so forth. They're all part of the same train. So this is really a continuation of making people aware of what's happening with the critical social justice movement, with critical theory and critical race theory and intersectionality, so on and so forth. So this is a continuation. I know that's a long way to answer the question, but yeah.
No, this is perfect because you're setting up so many different through lines that we're going to talk about here. But just recently, you're in Jacksonville now. I was in Jacksonville giving a presentation called Defeating Pro-Abortion Arguments. And I talked about it. It's like, guys, when you're defeating a pro-abortion argument, you're not just defeating a pro-abortion argument, you're defeating an entire worldview. Because who do you know that is like, what would you say? Anti-gun, anti-Israel, pro-drag queen story hour, pro-transing the kids, and pro-life. Like, that person doesn't exist. Like, you're taking on a panoply of demonic sources. And the thing about this is there's really a key point in the book, and I'll read this quote. And at the heart of much of the change is the idea that the battle is for the rights of so-called sexual minorities, and it's the latest front in America's civil rights struggle, stemming from a single lie that took root in our culture. Sexual orientation is no different than race. And so just that line alone, Voddie, if you had written that book back whenever you had first gotten the idea, you may not have a career now because you would have been like, it's pre-Obergefell, like this isn't that big a deal, like you're being, you're catastrophizing. But talk to me a little bit about this sexual minority status. And in addition to that, the fact that there's a non-evidentiary basis for the social upheaval that we've caused. There is no evidentiary basis whatsoever in any discipline to say that sexual orientation is no different than race. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I was accused of catastrophizing, of making too much of this, of, all sorts of things. But I mean, that's the play. And when you look at the documentation and the strategies, from not just back in the 80s, but all the way back in the 50s, there was some of this among civil rights leaders, right? I have some quotes in the book from one of Dr. King's speechwriters,
right.
Who was a notorious, a homosexual who had been arrested for, homosexual for lewdness in California. Name was, Bayard Rustin. And I mean, in no uncertain terms, he stated that homosexuals were the next phase in this. They didn't believe that Dr. King was the right one to put forward that particular argument, and they had others in mind to put forth that particular argument. But so this was there, right? This was there even back then in, the 1950s, 1960s, so on and so forth. So, for me, knowing that, understanding that, ideas have consequences, right? It just made sense. And it also made sense that if we bought that argument that this was akin to race, then eventually what would happen is the same rules would have to apply.
Exactly.
They can talk religious freedom all they want. But if it's the same thing, then I can't say no to a gay couple coming to my church, right? Any more than I can say no to a mixed race couple coming to my church. If it's the same thing, right? If it's the same thing, I not only have to bake the cake, but if I'm a Paedo Baptist, I got to baptize the child. I've got to, if it's the same thing. And for the longest time, they've been looking us in our face saying, we're not arguing for that. This is not gonna bother anybody, right? We just want to love who we love, And now it's, bake the cake, make the dress, or lose your business, you know? And eventually it will be stop preaching and teaching those portions
Correct.
of scripture, you
Right.
know, or else.
Well, Vodi, it was like it was little by little by little, and then all at once. Like that. That's how all
Yeah.
these things go. It's like it's a trickle, a trickle, a trickle, and then it's Niagara Falls. Now, at risk of blowing up my own interview here, because I have so much more about the book that I want to talk about. You talked about Martin Luther King Jr. So if we had time today, I wanted to bring that up because you make some very heavy implications in the book that you see Martin Luther King Jr. as a flawed man, as we all are, but a very particularly flawed man with bad theology. And I don't know if you have anything to do with the forthcoming Uncle Tom 3 that's coming out. I know you were in Uncle Tom 2, but I know that they are
Mhm.
going to be basically going right at Martin Luther King Jr., who it's hard to find a more universally beloved figure in humanity than Martin Luther King Jr. But then when you actually dig into his theology and hear about some of the things that he did in his personal life and some of the sexual deviance that he displayed, it tinges him a little bit differently. And so it's like, okay, do we look at him the same way we look at Thomas Jefferson, who gave us, the Declaration of Independence, and he was a slave owner and a rapist? Like, how do we hold Martin Luther King in tension of who he was as a man?
I think that's the answer. We have to hold that intention. We have to be able to hold that intention. For example, that's what I'm doing in the book, right? I
Right.
acknowledge that, but my point in bringing up King is that all of this stuff about white Christian nationalism is a farce.
Right.
All of this stuff about Christians being dangerous because we want to bring our faith to bear in the public square is a farce. Because simultaneously, we uphold the civil rights movement and Dr. King in particular, the Reverend Dr. King, who was doing the very same thing, right? If you look at his speeches, if you look at the things that he's arguing for, if you hear him in the March on Washington, he's doing the very same thing that we now call white Christian nationalism. And my point with bringing him up in particular is to say we don't have a problem whatsoever with people arguing for and pushing for their faith to be applied when it's in the areas that we approve of.
Mm-hmm.
And so, no, we absolutely don't have. So when liberal Christians, for example, are arguing for, inclusion of homosexuals, and, when liberal Christians are arguing for, whatever, feminist ideology, whatever, when liberal Christians are doing that, people are not saying, hey, you got to stop that. When liberal
Right.
Christians are doing that, they're being celebrated. So I use Dr. King really to explode the myth of, white Christian nationalism and our supposed fear of it.
What's funny about that in the my defeating pro-abortion arguments talk, I bring up the top 18 common pro-abortion arguments and how to systematically defeat them. And my favorite is no uterus, no opinion, because they don't care about people that agree with them. Like if you
Right.
agree with them, like, the all male Supreme Court that decided Roe v. Wade, mostly male
Exactly.
abortionists, mostly male abortion clinic owners, mostly male politicians that make pro-abortion laws. It's like, wait a minute, those guys get to have an opinion because you agree with them. It seems like you're full of crap. And so like that's
Yeah.
basically the point with that one.
Well,
Go ahead.
what do we say? This is a decision between a woman and her doctor.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, if her doctor's a man, how
exactly.
come it's okay for him
Well,
to
and then
help her make that decision?
you've got a major presidential candidate in RFK Jr. that says this is a decision between a woman, her doctor, and her spiritual advisor. And I said, okay, bet. Let me just assume that's true.
Yeah.
What if I consult with my spiritual advisor, whatever that means, and my doctor, whoever that happens to be, and they all decide along with me that I can walk next door and stab my neighbor in the face? It's like, oh, but hey, Mr. Policeman,
Right.
like I consulted with my doctor and with my spiritual advisor, and they said it was okay. We would never accept that in any other like corner of culture, but apparently with that we do. But to kind of get back to really some of the points you made in the book, and guys, there's way too much to the book for us to cover today. Like there's an amazing story about when you first started talking about this at the Texas, Senate in Austin, Texas, back in the early 2000s. You had to dust up with a senator and he wishes that he didn't show up to work that day by the time you were done with them. But I want to talk about the slow, calculated, methodical process of normalization of things that used to just be like abominable. And we all thought of it as abominable. And you actually pull out these 5 steps in the book and you point them out. Step 1 was change the name of the sin. Step 2, transform the behavior from a sin to an identity. Hello. Step 3, juxtapose that identity with the civil rights struggle of Black people and other minorities. Step 4, replace Christianity of the Bible with an apostate version that picks and chooses rites, rituals, and morals to suit the new regime. Hello. And then step 5, pretend to be surprised when other groups use the same tactics to try to normalize the unimaginable. Again, if you had read these steps off in 2014, pre-Obergefell, pre-Donald Trump being president, pre-COVID, pre-lockdowns, pre-BLM, pre-all that stuff, people would have been like, Kyle, why are you being so ridiculous? This is so far outside the Overton window. This isn't actually happening. And yet, this is the playbook that they followed. And got to say, worked like a charm.
Yeah, it did. It worked like a charm. And it ought to terrify us when we think about what's coming next. Because these steps are being followed, for example, with pornography. These exact same steps. I mean, I'm not pornography, but with pedophilia.
Polygamy.
Right?
Polygamy, pedophilia, polyamory, all of it.
Yeah, all of them. We're following the exact same steps. We don't talk about pornographers anymore. We talk about or pedophiles,
sex workers,
we don't talk about pedophiles anymore. We talk about minor attracted persons.
Right.
Or so they're MAPS or they're no MAPS, non-offended minor attracting persons. We don't do that. We don't talk about polygamy. We talk about consensual non-monogamy, right? That's the first step.
Everything is so stupid.
Yeah, man. You change the name of it. And then of course, the sin just becomes, an orientation, an identity. This is who I am. It's one thing. It's easy to argue against a behavior, right? But now, once I'm arguing against, a person's core identity, especially if they've identified themselves as an oppressed minority, well, now, I'm the devil. So yeah, that's what we do, and at the end of the day, when more stuff comes down the pike, we just act like we were surprised. But the piece of finding apostate Christians who will embrace it, that's an incredibly important piece. You find Christians who believe little and practice less, and they accept these things, and then we shine the light on them in order to say, look at what real Christ followers are like.
Right.
The rest of these people, are just, narrow-minded, bigoted, Nazi nut jobs. But these people over here who believe none of the Christian message, who deny every essential doctrine of the Christian faith, these people are the paragons of Christian virtue. And that's an important piece for them, which is ironic because, again, they don't want Christianity in the public square.
Hey guys, real quick, as you've likely heard me talk about on the show before, it took me forever before I started taking supplements of any kind. I was always nervous about taking like whey protein and creatine or really anything beyond that because I was just afraid of what was in the product and if it was going to like give me cancer someday or something like that. And I was always scared of these companies, these supplement companies, just cutting corners and using low quality products and eventually putting things in their products that could cause problems for me and my body. So I've always wanted to partner up with an American company that uses high quality quality ingredients in their supplements. And that's why I want to remind you guys that we are partnered with Jocko Fuel. So Jocko Fuel is Jocko Willink's American-based supplement company. So what are some of my favorite products that they make that I also use? They have the best tasting greens powder on the market. I love the peach flavor myself. They also make whey protein powder. The banana cream is my favorite. They make energy drinks. The Jocko Go energy drinks. My favorite is currently a tie between their iced tea lemonade and their pink lemonade flavors. I also use their Creel oil, their creatine, their vitamin D, and also their sleep aids. And they make a bunch of other stuff like ready to drink protein cookies, which are actually really delicious. My boys even like them, pre-workout powder, and much, much more. Guys, if you take your health and wellness seriously, then you've got to put high quality products in your body. Try Jocko Fuel out today by going to www.jockofuel.com. That's jockofuel.com. Use the promo code UNDAUNTED to get 10% off of your order. Again, that's jockofuel.com, promo code UNDAUNTED to get 10% off of your order. Well, the funny thing about it as well is those people will constantly be like, look at them. These are paragons of virtue and tolerance. And it's like, well, we don't get tolerance of sin as a biblical value. It's like, okay, pastor of this, woke left-leaning church, where exactly do you get this idea that we are to be tolerant of the sin within the sinner? Because I certainly don't get that when I read any of the gospel accounts, because I see a Jesus, a Christ, a Savior that is dealing not only with the sinner, but with the sin that the sinner is perpetrating. And obviously that just, you can't even talk about sin anymore because that's way too judgmental. But you mentioned it in your first answer earlier, Voddie. We're living in this post-Obergefell world where it's almost as if, for some people, church history started in 2015. How we are to do culture and how we are to, quote unquote, love our neighbor started in 2015. So let me read this quick quote from the book here. Obergefell has far-reaching consequences. The standardization of same-sex marriage overturned thousands of years of human history and tradition, threatened the fabric of Western civilization, and laid the groundwork for the persecution of Christians. You said it best when you said, most people look at this as like, hey, it's been decided. It's no big deal. I remember prominently during the run up to the 16 election, Ted Cruz was asked this. I think it was just him and Trump were left for the Republican nomination. And Ted Cruz was asked about gay marriage. And he's one of the most conservative people in public life. And he said, look, it's the law of the land. I don't think the federal government should have any standard. I think it should just be up to the states. But it is what it is. We can't really fight on it now. And it's not even in the top 25 of things that people are most fed up about. But it's one of those things that it signals a certain kind of sickness within our culture that has to be eradicated, but no one seems to be worried about it. So talk to us a little bit about kind of this post-Obergefell milieu we seem to be living in.
Yeah, that was a Caesar is Lord moment. That was a moment where the government said, we get to determine reality, right? Marriage is antecedent to culture, to government. I mean, it was here long before our government was here. Our government didn't invent marriage. It didn't give the right to marriage. It didn't take the right of marriage away from groups of people who are arguing that their rights were being taken away. I mean, you can no more take the right to marry away from a same-sex couple than you could take the right to become pregnant away from a man.
Correct.
Right? The government can't take, the right to something away when that something doesn't even exist. And so when they did that, when they made that declaration, that was a real Caesar is Lord moment. And I think, once you've gone down that road, once the government can dictate reality, once the government can, be seen to give rights as opposed to acknowledging the rights that were given by God, that's a dangerous place to be. And that's where we are.
When I guess, and we'll get to weak-kneed pastors here in a second, okay? Because, well, actually, you know what? We're going to do it right now. There's a great quote from the book. I just need to make sure I go back and remember something else. And I love this quote. The day will come when the full weight of the law will be brought to bear on churches that hold to a biblical view of marriage to obey man's law rather than God's law. And you talked about that a little bit earlier. And I think when that time comes, Voddie, that we will see these pastors fold like old lawn chairs, because pastors in America specifically have been asleep at the wheel. They've allowed things like this to happen. I'm reminded of what Eric Metaxas talked about in Letter to the American Church, where he talked about, hey, if a few hundred more, a few thousand more pastors in Germany had opposed the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, there would have been no Third Reich, no Holocaust, no World War II, and tens of millions of people would be alive or would have stayed alive, and it would have changed the entire course of history. And another quick quote before I get your comment here. Sermons on homosexuality these days die the death of 1,000 qualifications, not because the Bible gives special status to the sin of homosexuality, but because we've been jammed. So in the book, you talk about this concept of jamming. But I just got to tell you, Voddie, for every John MacArthur, for every Voddie Baucham, there seems to be 1,000 pastors that are go along to get along. Hey, I want to be known for what I'm for, not what I'm against, pastors. And then guess what? That small trickle, one drop, one drop, one drop, they don't realize what's happening until the Niagara Falls are falling on top of their head. Go.
Yeah, and that process is a process that's outlined in the After the Ball book, the 1989 book, and it's a 3-step process. It starts with desensitizing, right? Get the images out there and get people used to seeing them. Get the idea out there, right? You start with shows like Will and Grace, back in the day, where you get people used to the idea of homosexuality, homosexuals on the screen. Homosexual characters always have to be the best dressed, the most witty, the most intelligent, the conscience of the show, right? And so we desensitize. You get used to it. People stop being offended because they get so used to it. Then there's jamming, and jamming. Just think about the idea of juxtaposing the image of someone who's against same-sex marriage with the image of the Nazis and skinheads and so on and so forth. And so they're terrible people. So people don't want to be referred to that way. And so as opposed to just stating their position, now they defend themselves against that image before they state their position, and they state their position less forcefully because of that image that's been, created in their mind. And the last step is conversion. And conversion is, taking a person from being in opposition to being an ally. And I mean, that's exactly where we are. And when you see or hear sermons on homosexuality, and they start in a way that no sermon on any other sin would ever start. Like a pastor would never stand up and, preaching on adultery and say, listen, I have a lot of friends who are adulterers. I love adulterers. God loves adulterers. He's not going to start that sermon that way for any other sin that's discussed in the Bible. But he absolutely starts that way on homosexuality because we've been jammed.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important thing for us to think through as we're kind of going through the different topics that you bring up in the book. And that's the thing, as you're reading through the book, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, this is happening. And for a lot of people, they don't really realize this was happening. Maybe they got surprised. There are people that work 12-hour shifts on a rotating schedule, and like they don't listen to a bunch of podcasts, and they're not in the news, and they kind of see things being a little different in culture, and they're wondering if they're just an old fuddy-duddy. But it's like, no, this stuff is actually happening, and there's some nefarious people behind it. And that's one of my favorite parts of the book, is where you talk about 4 men who contributed directly to this modern thinking about sexuality, about sexual identity, queerness, all that kind of stuff. So you detail Alfred Kinsey, John Money, Marshall Kirk, and Hunter Madsen. Now, we don't have time today to dig into all 4 of those guys. So to everybody listening to this, make sure you go out and get the book. But I'd like for our time, Voddie, for us to focus on Kirk and Madsen, right? So we're going to get a little bit of a 2-for-1 here, because Kirk and Madsen, well, actually, let's talk about Kinsey and Money. So Kinsey and Money are two of the most evil men that you could possibly hear about. 2 absolutely horrifically terrible men. They are detailed and talked about in the documentary What is a Woman on the Daily Wire. You talk about them in the book, and I think most people have heard about them at this point. But I don't think most people have heard about Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen. I don't think anybody knows those names. And for me personally, I didn't know those names until I read the book. So give us an idea of who these 2 men are and how they directly contributed to our current societal moment.
So Kirk and Madsen are the 2 authors of the book that I referenced earlier, After the Ball. And they were Harvard professors, one in marketing and one in psychology. And what they put forward and after the ball was just the book form. They had done, articles on this and had, been speaking on this and rallying the homosexual community around this, particularly in the late 90s. And for those youngsters out there who are wondering why the late 90s would be significant, it's because of the AIDS crisis, right? So the AIDS crisis brought homosexuality and homosexual practice into the forefront of the discussion in the culture. And there was a moment there it was kind of on a razor's edge, because on the one hand, people were talking about the bathhouses in San Francisco and, other places, in New York where gay men would go, just for random illicit, sexual hookups, and how it was spreading this movement. That lifestyle was spreading or spreading this disease. Mm. And so Kirk and Mattson write this book, and they, kind of a twofold purpose. On the one hand, and they do have a whole chapter in the book saying there's some stuff we got to stop doing, or at least stop doing so publicly. Sort of acknowledging these excesses in the lifestyle. But on the other hand, they're arguing AIDS gives us an opportunity to present ourselves as a minority group in need of sympathy. And here's how we can do that. And that's where they propose this strategy, right? This propaganda strategy of, desensitizing, jamming, conversion. At the end of the book, they have a bunch of sample ads. These are the kind of ads that, we need to be, doing in radio, television, so on and so forth. And I mean, it's a masterful piece of propaganda. And like I said, if you read it today, it reads like a history book, because it's exactly what happened, and it achieved exactly what they wanted to achieve.
Well, in a nutshell, they have a quote, I think it's from that book. It says, "We are safest in the long run if we can actually make them like us." And so, yes, it goes back to Will and Grace, and it goes back to Modern Family, and it goes back to all these lovable characters. And what's funny is in the margin of the book, when I read that quote that I just read, I wrote, "and Mormons too." It's like, because what does everybody say about the Mormons? Gosh, they're just so nice. They're like literally the nicest people. And so you can get sucked in to this, anathema ideology, right? This false gospel, because the people are so nice. And so I don't think that the Mormons necessarily are doing it in the same way and planning it out like Kirk and Mattson, but ultimately that's where we see a lot of this work out. But one thing that you attack as well in the book, Voddie, is Christians using secular arguments to try to prove their point, and how that could be problematic and a potential, downfall of their argumentation from the beginning. So let me read this quote here. "For too long, Christians have swallowed the poison pill of trying to make secular arguments for our theological convictions. Unfortunately, some of the hardest people to convince of the rightness of arguing from biblical authority are Christians." Now, I will go ahead and throw myself at the mercy of the court here. I've done this exact same thing. So I've even said, and I even look at something, what is it, in Acts 17, where, Paul is using, he's talking to the Greeks in a language that they understand. He's using logic and reason before he goes to any Old Testament texts or to his eyewitness testimonies of the things that he's seen. So it's like, hey, use whatever authority they're comfortable with to at least start the conversation. But I think for a lot of Christians, Voddie, is they stay there. They have accepted this, this false facade and scaffolding of, well, there are things secular that need to be argued secularly, and then there are things theologically that need to be argued theologically. So how is that, and why is that so problematic when Christians do this?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. And number one, I'll say that in Acts chapter 17, Paul is absolutely not making a secular argument. He's arguing from the biblical meta-narrative. His story in Acts chapter 17 is creation, fall, redemption, consummation. The God who made the world and everything in it, right? So he quotes, some of their philosophers, but while he's making the argument for the biblical meta narrative and the God who created the world and the God who will judge, right? And he's talking about sin and redemption and all of that. So he's not doing their philosophy, even though he's, quoting their philosophers. The other problem with that is when we agree with them, when they say to us, listen, your God is irrelevant to this issue. And then we come back and say, okay, well, then I'll make an argument that doesn't rely on God. What we've essentially done is we've agreed. They say your God is irrelevant. And we say, okay, I agree with your premise. God is not relevant. Now let's have the discussion. No, we can't, we can't do that. We must not do that. And it's kind of what's gotten us to where we are. They are arguing not just that, same-sex marriage, transgenderism, transitioning children, so on and so forth. They're not just arguing that those things are okay. They're arguing that those things are okay because man is God, because Caesar is God, because the God of the Bible does not exist, and whatever he says is irrelevant, right? That's what they're arguing. And so if you give up on that premise, eventually all roads lead to this debauchery that we're experiencing.
When I think what it is it's seeding ground. I keep going back, I guess, because you reminded me, since you're in Jacksonville and I was just there recently, I keep going back to my Defeating Pro-Abortion Arguments talk, because from the very beginning, Voddie, I implore the audience, please stop seeding ground to the pro-abortion side. Like, be offensive. That doesn't mean be a jerk. But it's like this idea that we need to accept the defensive position in all arguments is so foolhardy and foolish. But again, I think people do think that the 11th commandment exists. Thou shalt be nice. Thou shalt be winsome. Thou shalt be a doormat. Allow people to just run all over us because somehow you got this idea that Christians are pacifistic and should be in all circumstances. It's just like, I just don't know where you get that. But also, I think one of the best examples we've seen of this recently, Voddie, is when Matt Walsh, who is, in charge of the What is a Woman documentary, works for Daily Wire, a great voice in the pro-life space, in the conservative space, Catholic, so he's got some issues there. But he was on the Joe Rogan Experience. I guess this would have been last year. And I think the last hour, so I think they talked for 3 hours. The last hour was them essentially disagreeing about gay marriage. And Matt Walsh basically saying, well, for thousands and thousands of years, marriage has been defined as one thing. And then all of a sudden the opinion and decision changes because of a ruling in 2015. And I just don't accept that. And that's pretty much all he could say. And all Joe Rogan can say is, well, why do you care so much about what people do in their own homes? Why should you be able to tell people who they can and can't love? And it was one of the most mind-numbing hours of narrative and conversation I've ever heard, because neither one of them was making a different point. They were just rewording the same point and changing who was talking at the time. So how about you help us? And you talk about this in the book. When people say, look, Christian, look, you right-wing, white bigot, like, why do you care so much? Look at you conservative pastor. Why do you care so much about what people do in their own homes? You do you, and you do your Bible studies, and you catechize your children, and we'll just be over here doing our gay stuff. Like, why can't that just be the answer?
Yeah, it can't be the answer because marriage is not private. Marriage is public. Marriage involves the state. Not only that, but marriage is antecedent to government. Marriage comes before government. It came before culture. We inherited marriage. God gave it to us. We didn't invent it. So when you do something like Obergefell, you are saying that the state has the right to determine what reality is and what our rights are. Well, first of all, as Americans, our Constitution makes it very clear our rights come from God, right? Our rights don't come from the state. The state just acknowledges those rights. The other problem with this is that it's not private in the sense that when we decide that marriage is between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, or whatever the state says, then we also decide that anyone who is holding on to those fundamental foundational ideas is now anathema, right? So now our textbooks has to be changed because our textbooks, were based on that same definition that we had for thousands of years. So you tell me, go home, do your religion at home, catechize your kids. Okay, but then my kids go to the school and the school says to them that your parents are teaching you lies, falsehoods, evil, bigotry, so on and so forth. Then you come and you say to my business, bake the cake or go out of business. Make the dress or go out of business. Then you come to my church and you say, do the wedding or face the consequences, right? Do the baptism, do the whatever, hire the person or face the consequences. Eventually, now we're saying, look across the room at that man and declare that that man is a woman. I don't care what you see. Declare what I said. Otherwise, you lose your job. I mean, how much of this is going to have to happen before we stop recognizing that this is not just people in their bedroom? Here's the other thing. There is a God. Period, full stop. There is a God. God is the one who gave us marriage. God is the one who made us in his image and made us male and female. God is the one who says that marriage is a living, breathing picture of the relationship between Christ and his church. It's blasphemy, pure and simple, and it is absolutely unacceptable. And because of that, the wrath of God has come, and we're experiencing in our culture in myriad ways that even Joe Rogan has acknowledged and is like mind blown over the things that he's seeing. But they all are downstream from the idea that we can determine what marriage is and that there is no God, there are no creation ordinances, and there's nothing that we're beholden to except for the whims of whoever's telling their truth more powerfully at the time.
Voddie, I love that. I love the way you put it. Let's even put a finer point on it, because I think people might get lost in the philosophy and they might get lost in some of the narratives. What do we stand to lose? And I guess you could say that as Christians, as Westerners, what do we stand to lose if we give up the fight for the definition and sanctity of marriage?
Everything. I mean, we stand to lose everything. What marriage is the bedrock of civilization. It's the foundation of every culture. If we're saying that marriage is no longer meaningful, if we're saying that we can now determine that, marriage is a right that is given and taken by the state, then what other rights are safe? What other creation ordinances are safe? If we can say that a man can become a woman, and anybody who denies that, right, is now on the wrong side of the law. I mean, we're done. We're absolutely done. There is no room anywhere anymore for arguments for any kind of reality, for any kind of morality, and eventually we end up in totalitarianism.
One, Voddie, if they can get you, and I'm saying they, like the nefarious they, if they can get you to say that man over there is a woman, if they can get you to say, yeah, two men can be married, they can get you to say anything, and they have caused you to redefine what capital T truth is. Because guess what? Capital T truth is not what the majority of humanity agrees inside of this culture that it is true. It is what God says is true. And as a Christian, if you claim to stand on the authority of the word of God or on the authority of the revelation of the triune God, you're going to have some issues if you cede ground in those two areas. But for the last question of the day, we'll go outside the book again, guys. The book is absolutely fantastic. It's called It's Not Like Being Black, How Sexual Activists Hijacked the Civil Rights Movement. You've got to go pick it up. But you talked about a little bit earlier, the closer we get to November, the closer we get to Joe Biden and Donald Trump, squaring off, this guy versus that guy, who's going to be our president and all that. We're seeing more riots. We're seeing more unrest in the country. There will very likely be a black criminal suspect that is killed under interesting circumstances, and that it'll be perpetrated by a white police officer. There's probably going to be some solar flare, and there's going to be like a climate change thing. There's going to be all this catastrophizing, and we're also going to be hearing about the rise of those white Christian nationalists, those people holding their Bibles in one hand and their AR-15s in the other. And it's all going to come to a head in November. And Voddie, no matter who wins, I don't think it's going to be good, because if Trump wins, he's Hitler. Like, it's the end of democracy, even though we're a constitutional republic, and it's going to be just the craziest thing that's ever happened. But if Biden wins, it's going to be they stole the election again, and we got to rise up, and we've got to do all these different things. I got to tell you, I'm a pretty comfortable dude, and I'm pretty comfortable taking care of myself, but I'm a little bit fearful about what's going to happen to our country and to our body politic when it comes to November. I know God's in control, but I'm worried. Give me, make me feel better or make me feel worse, but make me feel something.
Yeah. Listen, the kingdom of God is undefeated. That's what we have to remind ourselves of. The kingdoms of this world, they rise and they fall, but the kingdom of God is undefeated. This is not our home. We're just passing through, right? We're pilgrims in a strange land, and we need to think of ourselves that way, and we need to live that way. And we're not guaranteed ease. We're not guaranteed comfort. We've had it well, right? For the last, couple hundred years plus in America, better than any Christians anywhere at any time in world history. We need to be grateful for that. We need to pray that God will restore it. But if he doesn't, again, remember, the kingdom of God is undefeated. And, we're looking for a city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And as long as we keep that in mind, number one, we don't fret unnecessarily. But, number two, we can have the courage to stand against the tide. Because what most people do is they don't stand up because of the fear of losing their comfort.
Right.
But when our comfort is not the greatest and highest good, then that fear can't be used against us anymore.
Absolutely. It is always a pleasure to talk to you, but that's all for me. Is there anything else you want to get off your chest?
No, man, I just appreciate the opportunity. It's been really tough to get information out about this book, as you can imagine. I remember when Fault Lines came out, it debuted as a national bestseller. And I went to the bookstore the next week, big national, bookstore. And I go into the bookstore, and up on the shelves, in the front of the bookstore, they got all the bestsellers. And so it's me and my family, we go in there and we look at the bestsellers, and there are books on there that are behind my book on the bestsellers lists and stuff. And they're out there. I'll go around the back. They're not there. Okay. Go to the topics, and go to the alphabetical orders, not there. So I go to the desk and I said, hey, you guys have Fault Lines? They look on the computer and they go, oh yeah, we got 2 copies in the back.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like,
not surprising.
and that was it debuted as a national bestseller, So if that one was too offensive for them to feature prominently, this one doesn't have a chance. So, I just encourage people to go to get it, to, write reviews on it, let your friends know about it, post about it on social media. My social media posts about the book, we try to promote them, and that's rejected. And then there's shadow bans on other stuff that we're putting up. So, just, pray for us. And we just appreciate all the help that we can get in getting the word out about it.
Guys, it is in the show notes. And Voddie, you always have an open invitation to my audience. We would love to have you on. You keep cranking out books like this one, and we'll keep having you on. So until next time.
God bless you, brother.
There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed the return appearance of Voddie Baucham on the show. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So the links I've got for you today, I've got a link to Voddie's website, and then I've got Amazon links to all three of those books that I told you about. It's Not Like Being Black, Fault Lines, and Family Shepherds. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.